Hello guys, today we are going to discuss a history that almost never makes it into classrooms, documentaries, or polite conversation. A history that stretches across more than 1,000 years, across deserts and seas, across entire civilizations, and yet somehow still lives mostly in silence. It is the story of millions of African men, women, and children who were taken from their homes and pulled into one of the longest-running systems of human exploitation the world has ever known, the Arab and trans-Saharan slave trades. Imagine waking up one morning in a small village somewhere south of the Sahara. The sun rises the same way it always has. You hear familiar voices, the sounds of animals, children, cooking fires, the rhythm of ordinary life. You have a family, a name, a language, a place in the world. By nightfall, all of that can be gone. Armed men arrive. Some villages fight, some are overwhelmed, some are betrayed by rivals, but the result is the same. People are tied together, marched away, and pushed into a future they did not choose. That scene did not happen once. It did not happen for a single generation. It happened again and again for more than 13 centuries. When most people hear the word slavery, they think of the Atlantic Ocean, of European ships, chains, plantations, and the Americas. That history matters deeply. About 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic over roughly 400 years, and their descendants live today in the Americas, carrying memory, culture, and the demand for justice. But that is not the only slave trade that shaped Africa and the wider world. Long before the first European ships crossed the ocean, African captives were already being carried north across the Sahara, east along the Nile, and across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean into North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. From around the 7th century onward, vast networks of traders, merchants, and empires connected sub-Saharan Africa to places like Egypt, Arabia, Persia, the Ottoman world, and even India. Gold moved north, salt moved south. And in between, human beings were turned into commodities. Historians estimate that between 10 and 17 million Africans were taken through these routes over more than 1,000 years. Some scholars believe the number could be higher. The exact figures are debated because records are incomplete, but what is not debated is the scale, the duration, and the brutality of the system. Yet despite lasting far longer than the Atlantic slave trade, this history is far less known. There are no famous movies about it, there are no major public memorials, there are no global days of remembrance, and that raises a haunting question: how can something so vast leave behind so little public memory? To understand that, we first have to understand how this system actually worked. The trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades were not chaotic raids carried out by a few criminals. They were organized economic systems. Caravans crossed deserts in long lines. Ships sailed predictable routes. Markets existed in major cities like Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, Zanzibar, Baghdad, and Mecca. Taxes were collected, laws regulated ownership, slavery was woven into everyday life. African captives were sold as laborers, soldiers, domestic servants, and concubines. Their lives were reduced to price, age, strength, and perceived usefulness. The journey itself was often deadly. Caravans leaving sub-Saharan Africa cross some of the harshest environments on Earth. The Sahara is not just a sea of sand. It is a world of extreme heat, freezing nights, dehydration, disease, and exhaustion. People were chained together and forced to walk for weeks or months. Those who could not keep up were often left behind. Later travelers described seeing bones scattered along these routes, grim markers of how many had fallen. Survival was never guaranteed. But those who did survive did not find freedom at the end. They found markets. In North African and Middle Eastern cities, enslaved Africans were inspected, bargained over, and sold. Men might be sent to work in agriculture, mines, construction, or the military. Women were often taken into domestic service or forced into sexual exploitation. Some were sent to royal courts and wealthy households. Others disappeared into ordinary homes, never recorded in any official history. Every person was stripped of their previous identity. New names were given, new languages were imposed, new religions were often enforced. The goal was not just to control bodies, but to remake people. Over time, something very different happened in these regions compared to what happened in the Americas. In the Atlantic world, enslaved populations were usually kept separate, treated as a permanent racial underclass, and forced to reproduce within slavery. Their children remained enslaved. That created large, visible descendant populations who later fought for freedom and recognition. In the Islamic and Middle Eastern worlds, the pattern was different. Enslaved people were often freed after a period of service. Children born to enslaved women were frequently considered free and absorbed into the dominant society. That did not mean they were treated equally, but it meant they were no longer a separate slave caste. As a result, over generations, African identities were diluted. Languages were lost, lineages blurred. A person might know their grandfather was African, but their own children might not. Within 2 or 3 generations, the memory could fade entirely. Millions of people did not vanish physically. They vanished culturally. They became part of other peoples, other nations, other stories. That is one of the deepest tragedies of this history. Not just that lives were taken, but that entire heritages were slowly erased. This helps explain why, when we look at maps of North Africa and the Middle East today, we do not see huge, clearly defined African descendant populations like we do in Brazil, the Caribbean, or the United States. The people are there in faces, in genes, in families, but the memory is fragmented. The past was absorbed instead of preserved, and that absorption came with a cost. Even today, in parts of North Africa and the Middle East, social hierarchies and racial attitudes reflect the legacy of slavery. Darker skin is often associated with lower status. Certain words for black people trace back to terms that once meant slave. These are not ancient ghosts. They are living residues of a system that ended only recently. In some regions, legal abolition did not come until the late 19th or even 20th century. This was not ancient history. It was happening in the time of our great-grandparents. So why is this story still so quiet? Part of the answer is that it is uncomfortable. It complicates simple narratives about history. It shows that African elites sometimes participated in capturing and selling their neighbors. It shows that Arab, Persian, and Ottoman societies built wealth and power on African slavery. It shows that European powers, while eventually pushing for abolition in some areas, also benefited from the trade for centuries and acted only when it suited their interests. There are no easy heroes here, only systems of profit and power. Another reason is that memory usually survives through people. The Atlantic slave trade is remembered in part because its descendants are numerous and organized. They fought, wrote, protested, and demanded recognition. In the Arab and trans-Saharan systems, the very structure of slavery dissolved those communities over time. Without large, unified descendant groups to carry the story forward, the past slipped into the background. But silence does not mean nothing happened. It means something happened so thoroughly that it left fewer voices behind. That is why this history matters, not because it should be used to accuse or to divide, but because forgetting is another form of injustice. When millions of lives are reduced to footnotes or ignored entirely, the world becomes easier to lie to, and lies about the past shape how we treat each other in the present. In this series, we are not going to sensationalize. We are not going to simplify. We are going to look honestly at how this system worked, how it changed Africa, how it shaped the Middle East and North Africa, and why its legacy still echoes today. We are going to talk about the people who were taken, the societies that profited, and the quiet ways history was lost. The story we are telling does not move forward in straight lines. It moves along roads made of dust, heat, and fear. To understand how millions of Africans were pulled into the Arab and trans-Saharan slave trades, we have to step inside the machinery that made it possible. This was not just about raiders snatching people in the night. It was about a system that linked villages in the interior of Africa to markets thousands of miles away, and it worked because violence was turned into profit. Across large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, war had always existed, just as it did everywhere else in the world. But over time, the logic of war began to change. When outside traders arrived with weapons, cloth, salt, horses, and luxury goods, they also brought a new demand: human beings. Captives became a form of currency. A kingdom that could deliver more prisoners could trade for more guns, more horses, more prestige, and more power over its neighbors. Raiding was no longer just about defending land or settling disputes. It became a way to feed a global market. Some African rulers resisted this pressure. They tried to block caravans. They fought against slave-raiding neighbors. Others, however, adapted. They built their wealth and military strength around the trade. Over generations, entire political systems shifted. Wars were no longer fought only for territory. They were fought for bodies. Villages were attacked not to conquer them, but to empty them. Once captured, people were marched north or east toward the great trade routes. This is where the Sahara and the river systems became part of the machinery. The desert was not just a barrier between Africa and the Mediterranean world. It was a corridor. Caravans moved in long chains, sometimes stretching for miles. Each person was tied to the next. Guards walked alongside with whips and weapons. Water was rationed. Food was minimal. Anyone who collapsed slowed the entire group, and in a system built on efficiency, slowing down meant being left behind. The Sahara did not need to be cruel. It only needed to exist. Heat by day, freezing cold by night, sandstorms, dehydration, and disease did the rest. Over centuries, these routes became littered with the remains of people who never reached a market. European travelers who later followed these paths described seeing bones and skulls scattered along the way, silent evidence of how normal this loss had become. Those who survived the crossing entered a different world. Cities like Cairo, Tripoli, Tunis, and Zanzibar were not just cultural centers. They were hubs of trade, and enslaved Africans were part of that economy. Markets were organized. Buyers inspected teeth, muscles, and skin. People were sorted by age, sex, and perceived usefulness. A young woman might be valued for domestic or sexual service. A strong man might be sent to farms, workshops, or the army. Children were trained for household labor. Every life was assigned a price. This was not random cruelty. It was bureaucratic. Records were kept. Taxes were paid. Laws regulated who could own slaves and under what conditions they might be freed. In many societies, slavery was considered normal, even moral, as long as it followed certain rules. That normalization is one of the reasons this system lasted so long. When something becomes routine, it stops being questioned. Yet within this system, there was always resistance. People ran away. They rebelled. They formed maroon communities in remote areas. One of the most famous examples is the Zanj Rebellion in the 9th century, when tens of thousands of enslaved Africans in southern Iraq rose up against their masters and nearly brought down an empire. The revolt lasted for years and terrified the ruling elite. It was proof that even in the harshest conditions, people did not accept their fate quietly. But rebellions were rare and often brutally crushed. The system was simply too large and too deeply embedded. For every uprising, there were countless others who were isolated, scattered, and unable to organize. And so the trade continued. Over time, the flow of people reshaped entire regions. In parts of East Africa, towns grew wealthy from supplying captives to the Indian Ocean world. In the Sahel, kingdoms rose and fell based on their ability to control trade routes. In North Africa and the Middle East, households, armies, and economies became dependent on enslaved labor. This was not a side story. It was a central thread in the history of these societies. And yet, for all its scale, this system left behind fewer obvious traces than the Atlantic trade. There are no plantations to visit, no shipping logs that neatly record every life. Instead, there are fragments, court documents, travel diaries, legal texts, and the faint echoes of African ancestry in families who no longer know where their ancestors came from. To understand why this history feels so invisible today, we have to look at something deeper than chains and markets. We have to look at how identity itself was broken apart. Slavery in the Arab and trans-Saharan worlds did not only aim to control bodies, it aimed to control belonging. And when you control belonging, you control memory. When Africans were taken into these societies, they were not simply put to work and left alone. They were deliberately stripped of the things that connected them to their past. Their names were changed. Their languages were forbidden or slowly lost. Their religions were replaced. Even their clothing and hairstyles were altered. These were not small details. These were the threads that made someone who they were. Once those threads were cut, the person became easier to reshape. For men, the system often meant isolation. Many were placed in labor environments where forming families was difficult or impossible. They worked on farms, in workshops, in ports, in armies, or in the households of their owners. Some were freed after years of service, but freedom did not mean a return to their old identity. It meant trying to survive in a society where they had no kin, no homeland, and no recognized past. Their children, if they had any, grew up speaking the language of their new world, not the one their father had lost. For women, the process was even more intimate and in many ways more destructive. Enslaved women were absorbed into households. Many were forced into sexual relationships with their owners. Some bore children. Those children were often considered free, but free did not mean African. It meant Arab, Persian, Turkish, or whatever culture ruled that household. The mother's story was rarely passed down. Her pain was not recorded. Within 1 or 2 generations, her African origin could vanish from family memory entirely. This is how millions of people disappeared from history without disappearing from the world. They were not wiped out in a single catastrophe. They were dissolved slowly and quietly into other societies. Their bloodlines continued, but their stories did not. That is why when we look for large, clearly defined African descendant communities across North Africa and the Middle East, we mostly find fragments instead of nations. There are Afro-Arab, Afro-Turk, and Afro-Iranian communities today, but many families do not know exactly where their ancestors came from. The trade took not just lives, but continuity. And continuity is what allows memory to survive. This loss of memory has consequences. Without a strong sense of shared origin, it becomes harder to build movements, to demand recognition, or to force societies to confront what happened. The past becomes something vague, something easily denied or minimized. Over time, silence settles in, not because nothing happened, but because the people who could have told the story were scattered into other identities. And yet, traces remain. They live in skin tones, in family histories half remembered, in words that still carry the shadow of slavery. They live in social hierarchies that quietly associate blackness with servitude or lower status. These are not accidents. They are the echoes of a system that lasted for over 1,000 years. By now, one question should feel impossible to ignore. If this system was so vast, so long-lasting, and so deeply woven into the history of entire regions, why is it still so absent from public memory? Why do so few people know about it, talk about it, or learn it in school? The answer is not simple, but it reveals a great deal about how power shapes what we remember. One reason is that this history does not fit easily into the stories modern nations like to tell about themselves. Many countries in North Africa and the Middle East define their identities around ideas of civilization, religion, and resistance to Western colonialism. These are powerful and often justified narratives, but acknowledging centuries of African slavery complicates them. It forces societies to confront the fact that they were not only victims of exploitation, but also participants in it. That is an uncomfortable truth, and uncomfortable truths are often pushed aside. There's also the issue of religion. Because much of this trade occurred in societies shaped by Islam, people sometimes mistake criticism of historical slavery for an attack on faith itself. This creates defensiveness and silence. In reality, religious traditions, including Islam, Christianity, and others, have been used both to justify and to challenge slavery. Talking honestly about how a religion was practiced in the past does not mean condemning its followers today. But fear of that misunderstanding has made many people avoid the subject entirely. Politics plays a role too. In the modern world, international relationships are built on alliances, trade, and diplomacy. Governments choose which parts of history to emphasize and which to downplay based on what is convenient. Publicly highlighting this history could strain relationships, challenge national myths, and provoke difficult conversations about race and inequality. So it is often left out, not because it is unknown, but because it is inconvenient. Even in academic spaces, the topic has often been treated cautiously. Scholars know that the numbers are debated, that records are incomplete, and that the subject sits at the intersection of race, religion, and identity. That caution is understandable, but it has also allowed the story to remain buried. When experts hesitate, popular culture fills the gap, often with distorted or sensationalized versions that create more heat than light. Another reason for the silence is emotional. This history does not offer a comforting ending. There was no single moment of emancipation, no dramatic collapse of the system, no clear victory for justice. The trade faded slowly under pressure from outside forces like European naval patrols and colonial expansion. It did not end with apologies or reparations. It simply dwindled, leaving behind scattered lives and unanswered questions. People prefer stories with closure. This one offers none, but silence has a cost. When a history is not named, its legacies go unexamined. Racial attitudes shaped by centuries of slavery continue quietly. Social hierarchies based on color and origin remain often unchallenged. Without memory, there is no context, and without context, injustice looks natural. When people ask why this history matters, what they are really asking is something deeper and more uncomfortable. Who is responsible for remembering when the people who suffered were never allowed to leave behind their own voices? Most histories survive because someone carries them forward: families, communities, descendants who refuse to let their past be erased. But this system was built to dissolve those connections. It scattered people into new societies, new languages, new names, until the memory of where they came from slowly faded. So remembrance here does not come from inheritance, it comes from choice. Justice, in the way we usually imagine it, depends on survivors. It depends on living people who can point to the past and say, "This was done to us." In this case, that chain was broken. No court can hear testimony that was never recorded. No compensation can restore languages that were lost. No monument can list names that were never written down. That does not mean nothing can be done. It means the form of justice must change. The first responsibility is honesty. This history does not need exaggeration to be powerful. It does not need to be turned into myth or spectacle. Millions of people were taken. Millions suffered. Millions were cut off from their homes, their families, and their identities. That truth is enough. When we distort it, whether by denial or by sensationalism, we make it easier for others to dismiss it entirely. Honesty keeps memory alive. The second responsibility is balance. Remembering this history does not mean minimizing other tragedies. The Atlantic slave trade was a catastrophe. So were systems of forced labor in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Human cruelty has taken many forms. Acknowledging one does not erase another. It helps us see how adaptable exploitation can be and how easily it becomes normal when it is profitable. The third responsibility is restraint. This history does not belong to us to weaponize. It should not be used to justify modern hatred, to claim moral superiority, or to pit people against one another. The lives that were lost were not symbols. They were human beings. Turning their suffering into a political tool only repeats the logic of exploitation, using someone else's pain for present gain. The fourth responsibility is attention. Memory does not require grand monuments to exist, but it does require that we do not look away. It means teaching this history instead of skipping it. It means supporting scholarship that takes it seriously. It means being willing to talk about how its legacy still shapes attitudes about race, identity, and belonging in the regions it touched. None of that requires guilt. It requires maturity. The fifth responsibility is humility. We cannot fully reconstruct the lives that were erased. We cannot give names where none survived. We cannot bring back the songs, the stories, and the languages that were lost. What we can do is refuse to let absence be mistaken for insignificance. A lack of records does not mean a lack of suffering. A lack of monuments does not mean a lack of crime. Sometimes remembering means standing in front of an empty space and saying, "Something should be here." When archaeologists uncover remains in deserts, bodies left behind when caravans decided someone was no longer worth saving, they do not find stories, they find evidence. Evidence that people walked until they could not. Evidence that a system valued efficiency over life. Those bones do not accuse, they do not demand. They simply exist, asking the living one quiet question: will you let this be forgotten again? The Atlantic slave trade left descendants who ensure it cannot be erased from history. This trade left far fewer voices behind, which means remembrance is not inherited. It is chosen. Chosen every time someone decides to learn rather than turn away. Chosen every time a teacher includes this history instead of skipping it. chosen every time we refuse to accept silence as proof that nothing happened. The woman taken from a village that no longer exists, the man who collapsed on a desert road, the child whose name was changed and whose language was lost, they do not need us to imagine their pain in detail. They need only this, that we acknowledge they lived, that we acknowledge they were taken, and that we acknowledge they mattered, even though the system was designed to make the world forget them. Memory, when it is honest, is not about owning someone else's suffering. It is about refusing to let it disappear. And sometimes that is the only justice that is still possible. If this story meant something to you, don't just watch it and move on. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. Let this history be seen, shared, and remembered, because some stories survive only if we choose to carry them.